It's easy to put on when you're on the treadmill or something. Or
I picture you wearing like Rocky shorts from the first movie, going around the house.
Is it acceptable for me to get one of those silk sleeveless robes?
This is On Repeat.
You're not built for this. These boys coming here, they gotta fight for life. People die in the ring. Your daddy died in the ring. I don't know him. Ain't got nothing to do with me. I've been fighting my whole life. It's not a choice for me. Every punch I ever thrown's been on my own. Nobody showed me how to do this. I'm ready. This picture's from the 10th round of the first fight, right? I heard about a third fight between you and Apollo, behind closed doors. Is that true?
How do you know all this?
I'm his son. A great fighter once said, "It ain't about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward."
See this guy here? That's the toughest opponent you're ever going to have to face. I believe that's true in the ring, and I think that's true in life. Now show me something.
Between terminals A and B of the Philadelphia International Airport, there is an unconventional art exhibit. One experience as the moving walkways pull you and your luggage along. Where other major cities have kiosks, newspaper stands, and Cinnabons, Philly has an ode to the city itself. The walls are lined with framed posters of films set and shot in Philadelphia. As you glide past poster after poster, you realize how rich of a cinematic history Philly has. Sure, there's 1986's Mannequin, of course 1993's Philadelphia, 1998's The Sixth Sense, and a host of other M. Night Shyamalan movies. Despite that history, the city will forever be linked to one film and one film only. 1976's Rocky. The American Film Institute ranks Rocky, a boxing movie about going the distance, about respecting oneself, as the second greatest sports movie of all time, behind Raging Bull, another boxing movie. On this episode of On Repeat, we won't be talking about Rocky, really, but it'll be impossible not to as we revisit 2015's Creed, in which the former heavyweight champion of the world, Rocky Balboa, serves as a trainer and mentor to the son of his late friend and former rival, Apollo Creed. Creed functions as both a sequel and spin-off to the Rocky franchise, which at the time of Creed's production spanned 6 films over 30 years, all written, starring, and mostly produced by Sylvester Stallone. This time, Ryan Coogler is at the helm in his second major project. By all measurements, the film is a box office success, turning its $35 million budget into $173.6 million worldwide. It earned Sly Stallone an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. And it certainly is a movie that deserves to be on repeat. I'm Brad, Bam Bam Bovenkerk, and joining me today in the red corner, weighing in with hot takes and movie mistakes, is Paul, the Bearer, Krogmeier, and in the blue corner, the pride of Central Illinois, Dave, the Freak, Feeney. So let's start with this. What makes a sports movie worth rewatching? What makes a good sports movie? Round one.
What's the tail of the tape? That's a good boxing reference for a good sports movie.
Love it.
Feeney, we'll start with you. Sports movie, define it. What do you look for?
Well, I'll continue the boxing metaphors and say, you got to talk about reach, right? And so one thing is that there has to be an underdog component to it. The best sports movies are something where it's somebody that we don't expect to be successful, and they have to show great grit to somehow get there. And so we see ourselves as that underdog, so we identify with that. I also think that there has to be not only enough action to sustain the, casual viewer of the film, and I think a lot of times that is what makes it rewatchable, is the fact that I can tune in and, in a few minutes there's going to be a fight, there's going to be a boxing match. But there also has to be enough plot and heart to give the film inspiration. And I think the best sporting movies combine those, where it's not just the sport, it's not just the action, but they have some heart as well. And that's what makes Rocky, I think, the classic series, and it goes right into Creed, is that you have this combination of action with heart.
If we think about sports and how well intertwined it is with America, you think about Americana and baseball, and you think about boxing being integral in America's history, and now you think about today's world, and all the most popular, successful sports leagues are housed in the United States, and they talk about the World Series and champions of the world coming from the United States. And we're seeing now with this pandemic that how integral sports is to our culture, right? And it's not just a money-making machine, and it's not just entertainment venue, but it is life for so many people, just casual fans. We're not just talking about hardcore, but season ticket holders. So it is fascinating to me to think about how sports come through in our entertainment, and Rocky kind of embodied that, what Feeney was talking about with the underdog story. You have to have an underdog. And then I think it's all about kind of being a metaphor for the American dream, right? So we all buy into this idea. It's what brings us together, because we're different in every single way. And America is this big, science test that we can all be together in these different cultures. But the only thing that ties us together is the American dream. I read that Sly Stallone said that all you want is a slice of the American dream. He said that's what Rocky was about, having the opportunity not to win, not to set records, not to someday be made into a statue, but just having the opportunity to run the race and see if you can finish. In the original Rocky, that's all he wanted, right? Go the distance was the quote. So I think that's really what pulls us in, is to see that person who just has a chance to finish and to test themselves against themselves. And he always talks about the opponent being yourself and not the other person. He talks about that in Creed. So I think it's all about the American dream and that collective we can buy in. And it goes way beyond the sport that's on the screen. It goes into that mantra that we all buy into.
Yeah, I think, to build off of what you guys both said, I couldn't agree more that, Paul, that sports are more than sports. Sports are a metaphor for the human experience, and in essence, the things that we define as the American experience, that kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And Dave, you talked about the idea of grit, determination, the underdog, that nothing is impossible. And then that balance of heart and action. And if I think about some sports films that don't hold up, Varsity Blues is an example of a sports film that I really enjoyed when I first saw it. But that film is so heavy on the sports sequences. And it's because at the heart of it, it is lacking in heart, determination, character development. And it's missing, I think, one of the tenets of a really good sports film, where it's the training montage. And that's not saying Varsity Blues doesn't have the montage. It does. And it's set to a great Foo Fighters song, right? There goes my hero. And that amps you up. But you know it's cheating, because it relies so heavily on the music as opposed to the actual story there. So when I think about some of my favorite sports films, so much of it is heart. It's determination. It's you told us we were down and we were out and we couldn't. And so some ways you see that self-improvement is the training montage. And in some team sports, a lot of that is the team training montage, right? They're coming together. I would say A League of Their Own is a phenomenal sports movie that I love. Remember the Titans, as saccharine as it can be, has those moments of coming together. So I think that having a heart in the center is such an important quality. And I think Rocky, like you said, Paul, has so much heart, and we'd be remiss to to not talk about the fact that Creed and Rocky in a lot of ways are the same movie. And so Creed has a lot of that same heart. And so I think we have to get to that. But my follow-up question then would be to narrow that down, right? If we're thinking about like what makes a good sports movie, my follow-up is, why is boxing so cinematic? And so, Paul, in your research, how many boxing movies did you watch?
The answer is 13.
Can you give us a rundown for some of us that couldn't name 13 boxing movies if our life depended on it? What did you watch?
There's the 8 Rocky movies. I'm surprised that we're at this point. Even I don't think even Sly thought it would make it this far. And then I watched the new Bleed for this because I really like Miles Teller. I never got around to watching that one. I rewatched Raging Bull because, as you said, that's supposedly the greatest sports movie of all time. I wanted to compare some of that. $1 Million Baby has a lot of similarities to the way Clint Eastwood plays the old curmudgeon and coming out as the trainer and giving it to the next generation. So that was interesting to see the parallels there. The Fighter I just picked up because Christian Bale was amazing in that movie, and I like Marky Mark. I watched so many that's only 12, so I can't even keep track of the last one.
Southpaw?
Southpaw. I did watch. Yeah, that's it. Southpaw. I never got around to watching that one, and people always said that was a good one. And I don't know. I like Jake Gyllenhaal a lot, but that one had some flaws. It was good to watch some bad ones too, because I felt like then you could see what not to do and why the good ones work and why the bad ones don't work. And so watching Rocky V helped me in that situation, figuring out what not to do. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And your question about what's going on with boxing movies, I've always been drawn to boxing movies. I don't know why. And to your point, boxing has been such an integral part of the old school Americana, just like baseball. And now boxing is not really a popular sport. And so it's always fascinated to me that we still make boxing movies as a culture and we still show up to watch them. And we can make 8 Rocky movies and yet people still show up, but they won't watch regular boxing. So why is that? Why is it so cinematic to get people's butts in the seats for, you talked about the millions of dollars it made Creed on its opening weekend, but then why has boxing withered on the vine as a sport? Some of that is the violence, I think, you see people shedding away from things like CTE and these sort of violent sports. Some of it is the mismanagement of boxing. People have made a big deal about that. They expanded the weight classes and promoters and corruption and things like that in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But just in general, like, why aren't people watching boxing compared to the movies? I think the movies make it more, obviously this cinematic touch that adds to it makes it more exciting. So the first thing I always talk about in our film class, Silver Screen, is when we talk about slow motion, the reason slow motion is so compelling is because it adds like this athletic grace to your movements, You always talk about like people look good doing anything in slow motion. There's a Dave Chappelle bit about that. You can look it up. It's not really appropriate. And then you're doing things that are like, ridiculous things, but when you do it in slow motion, it looks cool, right? And then there's the idea that like war movies are always in slow motion too. And so violence looks very good in slow motion. We can watch someone like gunning someone down in live action and be like, oh my gosh, that's terrible. But we watch it in slow motion and you're like mesmerized, right? And so boxing
that's Arnold Schwarzenegger's whole career is slow motion holding heavy gunnery. Yeah, so I buy it.
Rambo, the clips falling out. Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. That has always fascinated me, the idea that slow motion is so well put into those movies. And that's one thing. And the other thing I got from it was the idea that the story structure just builds perfectly into a movie, right? There's always the underdog at the beginning, as you guys talked about, and then he has to decide to take the fight, and then there's a mentor. It almost takes the hero's journey type of thing, and it gets to the big culminating fight at the end, and it just makes a perfectly paced, 3-act, whatever you want to call it, thing to where you get to the end and you can let the credits roll. So some movies mess with that format a little bit, and that's interesting to see how some of them are successful in doing that and not. But it's always interesting that we have like this genre specifically for this one sport, but it's not even popular anymore. But we still love that movie. What do you guys think? Feeney?
Well, I also think it's interesting when you bring up how it's tied to Americana, because in the original Rocky, they really played up the idea that, and part of the reason Rocky gets to fight is because they like his name, the Italian Stallion. And boxing used to be this thing that was very much tied to the different nationalities that we have. It's very much like, the Irish, which we even still see with McGregor. That some of these things that are really played up, that maybe as generations continue are losing a bit of their, luster, so to speak. I also think that going back to part of the reason why boxing movies I think are so popular is that, one, it is this sense of the different types of conflict, that you mentioned they get to in Creed with fighting the man that's in the mirror. You have so much of it is that you have to believe in yourself and you're fighting yourself. But meanwhile, you do have this, big bad heavyweight champ across from you that's trying to break your head. And I also think part of the reason that they're compelling is because movie boxing is so much more exciting than actual boxing, because every punch lands or is, unbelievably avoided. But it's not just, if you watch a Floyd Mayweather fight, it's not exciting. I mean, they're just defense for the most part, and it's going to come down to the judges' cards. And very rarely do you ever see actual fighters just exchange unbelievable headshots like they do in seemingly every Rocky movie. And so that does draw you in, I think, to the excitement that exists there.
And you made an interesting point about boxing, like being uniquely suited there because it's more exciting to watch the movie than the sport. Like, it made me think about football and basketball are the two most popular sports by far in, casual United States viewers. And those movies don't do very well. Like, outside of maybe like a Remember the Titans, which is so far away from the actual sport, right? It's just all about, the little girl and Denzel being Denzel, like it's so much about like the character building when you do a really good movie about those. Hoosiers comes to mind, or, some of these basketball movies that are really good is all about because we're so invested in those characters. And so the actual sport isn't that fun to watch because it's not that cinematic. But boxing is so cinematic. You can make it cinematic. And I hope we talk about Kugler because he's just amazing the way he makes these shots cinematic. And, the first Rocky didn't really do that as much. So we could talk about maybe why does that work so well, because it isn't as cinematically gifted, the director at the helm. But it is interesting to see that you're right. Watching the movie version is so much more exciting. And other sports aren't that way.
I think part of why boxing on film versus boxing as a professional sport comes down to accessibility a little bit. That the roots of boxing, like you talked about, were in this kind of blue collar street. It was accessible. These were things that were happening in neighborhoods, and that you could go to the neighborhood gym and you could work your way up. And in the 90s with Foreman and Tyson, it became HBO. It became Las Vegas, that a sport for the people, right? That all it really took was some tape and some gloves. And you didn't start with tape or gloves to get there. Became something that was about millions and millions of dollars, right? Like then it became prize fighting, and it became about the prize. It became bigger than where it started. So I think like the megalomania kind of hurt it a little bit. I think that when it became pay-per-view, you lose connection with the common man. And I think that at the root of it, this is for the common man. I'd also say that maybe boxing advanced into MMA or UFC or that realm. And the things that we like about that continued to grow, that scrappiness, that determination, that grit. And instead of just hands, we started to involve knees. And maybe that was the next logical step. And I think that some people look at boxing and romanticize it because it was less gratuitous. It didn't glorify violence the same way that UFC might. But I do think like they're related, right? They might not be siblings, but they're definitely cousins, right? There's some genealogy that they share. I think on screen, why boxing works so well is how simple of a sport it is. There are two opponents from two corners, and they have their support right there in their corner. But for the length of the round, it is just them. And you can hear what's being shouted at you, but it's up to you to do something with. And then you go back to the corner and the support's there, the care's there, but you're going to go back out and it's just you again. In a football movie, there are 11 guys. And so I have a cast of characters. If I think about the full team, there's 22. I can't develop all of those. I can't get the audience to invest in all of those. But in a boxing movie, I can give you one character and he can battle his outward demon. And because of the type of person it's going to take to be a boxer, to subject themselves to this violence, right? I'm not just throwing punches, I'm taking punches. There have to be some inner demons there. And Creed does a really good job of letting you see those inner demons because it doesn't say boxer, it says fighter. And so Michael B. Jordan's character, so he's playing the son of Apollo Creed, Adonis Creed, but he recognizes himself as Johnson by his mother's last name. And that's what he's been fighting. And so when he steps into the ring, it's just a metaphor for everything else that he's been dealing with, internal and external. And so I think the boxing ring works so well because it strips away all the other BS we see in a movie, especially a sports movie. And then it is just a place to confront those inner demons outwardly. And it does it in a constrained time period. And you have 12 rounds to do it. There's no overtime. And you can win or you can lose. I don't know if there's a draw. I don't think that they're like, all right, there's a draw, right? Like there is a determined outcome. So I think just that idea, the type of character it lends itself to, it has to be an underdog. What's interesting about the Creed story is that Adonis doesn't have to be an underdog. But because of his emotional backstory, because of the things that have happened around him, to him, he feels the underdog. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about Creed that sets it up as different from Rocky, is that Rocky is a kid from the streets who works his way up to millions and riches, who builds a name for himself. Creed takes that idea. This is a kid from privilege at a certain point, right? There was a 7 or 8 or 10 year period, depending on how old he was, when he's adopted by Felicia Richard's character. But he's a kid who's grown up with privilege, who has a last name if he wants it, who has a legacy if he wants it, but he wants to make his own name. And so I think in a lot of ways, this movie is beat for beat very similar to Rocky, but I think it has its own voice. It has its own name. And I think that's a really cool thing, because if it was just a reboot of Rocky, that idea of building your own name wouldn't work. And so the fact that it can stand apart is one of the reasons for me it is such a movie that you can go back to. So you want to talk about how it matches up?
Go ahead,
Well, one thing I want to touch on, Brad, that you said is, one, talking about Felicia Rashad real quick. She is always Claire Huxtable to me.
Always.
So I have trouble seeing her in anything else and not thinking that, Theo is going to walk through the door. But the other thing that I find fascinating is that they made it Apollo's, illegitimate son. There's this aspect of, to get all English teacher on you, there's this aspect of King Lear, with his bastard son Edmund, who, doesn't feel legitimate, and it drives his whole evil character. And in this case, Adonis, his line in that movie where he says, "I want to prove that I'm not a mistake." That is man, that is man versus self right there. And that's what he's literally been fighting this whole time. And then, but the other idea is that it made me think, what if it wasn't an illegitimate child? What if Apollo had a son and he got to live that life of privilege the whole time? We view this movie very differently. You know, part of the reason that he is the underdog that we're rooting for him is because the movie starts and he's in that juvenile detention center and he's fighting for something and he doesn't even know who he is. And then he's reluctant to take the name. You know, he's like, I don't know him. That's not a part of me. And he has to be talked into it by Bianca, his girlfriend, to even take the name Creed, that it does belong to him. And so it emphasizes this idea to the audience. This is not someone, even though he's had that privilege, as you said, he's been living in that house. He had the great job making great money. But even though he had that, we don't view him as privileged because he's reluctant to take it, which I think makes him more admirable for the audience than if we saw him for the rich guy. I mean, he goes in there, he has a nice car, and he's willing to gamble it away. And so again, he's got money, but we view that differently because he's reluctant to embrace it, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, and something else you were talking about, Brad, was that idea of him like needing the ring to be his own personal, get out his personal demons. And I think that's such an important moment, kind of bringing it with all these boxing films, is like there has to be a drive as to why this person is going to get in this ring and take massive amounts of punishment and do this insane thing that none of us else would ever do. Why are they doing this? What's the drive? There has to be a drive. Sometimes it's like toxic masculinity that comes out in a lot of boxing films. It's just ego, it's pride. But the best ones really make it personal. And I think that's what makes Creed so really good is, like Feeney was talking about, he has to prove it to himself. And then the mirror scenes and all those other ideas take on extra significance because he is doing this for himself. And so many of the good ones, I think, do that. They're maybe doing it for their family or their hometown, like in watching Raging Bull, and a lot of people make the comparison there of being the best sports film, and then with Rocky, like Jake LaMotta, De Niro's character, like he doesn't have a same like urge and fight. He's really doing it more for toxic masculinity reasons, that he's just doing it for ego. He's doing it to get control over his life and his situation. He's a fighter who kind of finds his whole life spiraling out of control, and his wife is, he's suspicious of her, and he's losing money, and there's all these things that he's just fighting in the ring to gain control over his life. And in that film, like in so many of the other films I watched, like it's not as believable. Like I love the idea that Creed is coming into this situation to gain respect, because in so many boxing movies, that's all it ever is. Like Rocky wanted to go the distance in the first one because he wanted respect. He didn't care if he won or lost. And then when he walks out, he's excited, and Creed is defeated, and he's the winner, and it's all about respect. And so many of these movies talk about this idea that like you're only fighting for respect. It's not about the payday. It's not about the belt. It's not about the win. And if you don't get the respect, and some of the other Rocky movies touch on this point, right? You don't even have to win, or you have like champions. Maybe we can talk about Mr. The Line? What's his name? Mason the Line Dixon.
Mason the Line Dixon.
Mason the Line Dixon. Rocky Balboa.
That he has the title and he has the belt, but no one respects him, right? So that's the most important thing, is respect, and that sort of pride in yourself, rather and other people seeing you as a true champion and proving it to yourself.
I think a lot
That's why in Rocky V, your favorite movie, Paul, Tommy the Gun is finished at the end, even though he just got beat up in the street. He's still the champ, but he is finished. And in Creed, they do make the line, the announcers actually say that Pretty Boy Ricky Conlon won the fight, but Adonis Creed won the night.
Won the night, yeah.
Yes. And to your point.
Good line.
So much of this movie is about fathers and sons. And this comes at a time where Sylvester Stallone's real-life son, Sage, had just passed away from a heart attack. Sage played Rocky Balboa Jr. in Rocky V. 4 and 5, or was it just 5?
It was just 5, you're right. Just 5.
And so So Dave, when you talk about if Adonis was Apollo's legitimate son, we had seen glimpses of that in Rocky V, right? Like the heir to the throne. And I think what I like so much about this film is that it plays up fathers and sons. And there's this moment early on when Adonis has just come back from Tijuana and he's alone in Tijuana. And then we've got that 12-hour later, he's at the office and he goes in, and the shot is framed in such a way that when you see his boss in the left-hand side behind him is a picture of the father and his daughter. And it's set up in a way where it's almost the only thing on the left side of the screen behind a big window. And it's hard not to notice. Then Adonis goes home and his mom talks about his new office. Did you see it? All these things where she knows so much about what's happening in his work world, but it doesn't seem like that's relationship based. It seems like he was given a hand up. And maybe that's my reading of it. But it does seem like it was something that was given as opposed to earned. Then when he ends up in Philadelphia, you have these moments where there's Leo the lion, and it's his dad training him. When we get to Creed 2, it's Drago and his son. When we go to the second gym in Creed, the sparring partner, our father and son. Mm-hmm. And so there's just this idea of father and son and father and son and father and son. And even if you think about like Philadelphia to me feels like, and I know it's the city of brotherly love, but it also feels like it's a place like the birthplace of the independence. Like it feels like a place that is familial. And so I think just in terms of like the setting, you have things that feel familial. Right? Like that Philadelphia was all about trying to separate ourselves from our father, right? From England. And I think that's way too English teachery for what the movie's doing. But on a deeper level, the writer of all of the previous Rocky movies was Sly Stallone. And in a lot of ways, what separates Creed from repeating the stories of Rocky is that this was written by Ryan Coogler. It's the first movie in the franchise where Rocky doesn't pen it. And I think that allows it to have its own voice. And so what I'd want to talk about a little bit here is kind of the overlap, like the Venn diagram. What is Creed doing that in a lot of ways makes it Rocky 1? And then where do we see it separate from Rocky 1? Because I think some of the criticism it got from some people was that like this was just a reboot of Rocky. But I don't fully believe that. And I think you could argue both ways. So I want to talk about how this matches up as the Rocky story structure or where we see the similarities. So does anyone want to jump in maybe with that, their thoughts there?
Well, I do think there are a few aspects, even the love story aspect between Adonis and Bianca. And we go back to the first one, you have Rocky and Adrian. I mean, you have some of these things of...
Yo, Adrian!
Even some of the things with Bianca coming in the ring after fights, and there are those scenes with Adrian where she did that. Also, the hospital scenes, ring a bell, get it in my mind. And so, when Adrian was expecting in the first one or something, and she fell. Is that right? Was she expecting, or did she just fall?
I think that's the second one.
Okay. And I just remember that when she is... she's ill and Rocky doesn't know if he's going to train, and then he says something to her where it's like, what do you want me to do? Do you not want me to fight? And then she has that great line.
This time win.
She goes, yeah, I want you to win. Right? And then Mickey's like, what are we waiting for? And they'll go fight. And to me, it's the same thing with seeing Adonis in the hospital with Rocky. It's really interesting how they worked some of the training montage in where Adonis is literally doing some of the workouts in the hospital. And then Rocky, I thought they even threw a little bit of an homage to that it is the same when Rocky is telling him, hey, sometimes I did those push-ups with one arm. And then Adonis does that. And we all remember those scenes with, Sly doing that. So I think, to me, it gets away with it because I thought they were clear that they were this and that they knew they were doing it. It's not like they're trying to fool you. They knew they were doing it. And so they're just playing up the same thing. And he is the mentor. So he's teaching, hey, this is how we did it. I think it's new enough, and there are enough elements of other, even with some of Bianca's character and what they're all fighting, that Bianca is going deaf, that Stallone is fighting cancer, or that Rocky is. These ideas that there are some new parts to it that's like, okay, they're all fighting. It's not just Adonis. And then one quick thing that I think also is one of the heroes of the character being, Mrs. Creed. I mean, how amazing is this that she goes in and rescues her late husband's illegitimate child? I mean, this isn't her kid, and that she goes in and is this. So I think there's a bunch of layers to this film that I don't feel like the original Rocky had all of those kind of pots in the fire.
I'm gonna Can I hop in for a second, Paul? Because I want to say something about Mrs. Creed. The hurt and the pain that she feels when her son, her adopted son, who she clearly loves, despite the pain that his existence might cause, right? He is a signifier of her dead husband's infidelity. And that level of self-sacrifice where how does she find out about him? How does she hunt him down? Like the backstory we don't see. And so brings him in and raises him as her own. And she has that line about having to wipe Apollo's ass.
Yep.
And that seems like just a very dirty, gritty, here's the reality of being a boxer's loved one. At the first fight, when it seems like Adonis is going to back out and they cut the gloves off because he's like, who's going to wipe my ass? He doesn't have anyone. And they cut the gloves off. And to me, that just seemed at first like a moment I never caught on to. But on this repeat, it was like, oh, this is the middle of the story. His relationship with Bianca is fresh. It's new. She walks out at that moment. And so that's one of those places where it's like, this is the beginning of those relationships. And what we see with Mama Creed is like, that's the reality of once those are solidified, even though they might have their flaws. So I think there's a lot of power in that, of driving home that sense of value, like support team, staff, people around you that Rocky had.
I think that goes really well with what Paul mentioned earlier, equating this a little bit to like a war movie. Because, you have the war movies that glorify war, and then you have the war movies where you see the grit and the nastiness of what war is. And I think boxing movies fit that really well because real war, there's a lot of sitting around and not a lot of action. And then the action happens and it's horrible and horrific and it's hell. And I think Creed does a pretty good job of showing some of that because the series of Creed, because in this one you get those references that you mentioned, Paul or Brad, and then the next one you get the, where he's peeing blood and he's in horrible pain, and you see some of the suffering that they're putting themselves through. It's not just, oh, I had a fight and I'm wearing sunglasses because I have a black eye. This is taking a toll. And Rocky does some of that with in Rocky 5, where he's, they tell him he's got brain damage and he can't fight. I mean, they do some of it, but I do think they keep reminding you, hey, this isn't just a sport that you go play. This is something where you're suffering.
And I think it's different enough from the original Rocky. There's so much reinvention in it. And like when they do make those references, like Feeney said, that it's so obvious that they're doing it, that it's more of an Easter egg and an homage and a callback. And the fans love that, right? As long as you're making it clear that you're doing that, it's not just copying. It does remind me of like the Star Wars reboot that happened recently, and J.J. Abrams takes the helm and he just kind of like redoes everything. But there wasn't like a reinvention to it, you know, and it felt so much like Star Wars: A New Hope, the number 4, that the first one in this new trilogy did, that, you know, people liked it because that is a good movie and that storyline does work. But it's like you didn't reinvent it. And there's so much more reinvention in this movie than there was in the original Rocky. You know, like it's so different. I think about, like you guys were talking, that he has options when he comes in. He has this job that he's clearly doing well at. He gets a promotion and then he quits. He has the silver spoon situation. He has this last name he could fall back on if he chooses not to. He has all of these things, and the only thing that drives him is this other thing that's this internal torture. And in the original Rocky, you know, we're not even really sure why he's slumming it in Mickey's gym, right? Like he's just kind of there because he doesn't have any other options, and he's kind of dumb and blockheaded, and he can't make it at the meat packing plant, and he's always trying to find a job. And there's not like a drive. And then he suddenly
beating up guys that haven't paid their bills.
He's just smacking the meat around, you know. It's like, what's the drive, you know? He eventually agrees to the fight from, you know, Mickey's and Adrian's encouragement, but, you know, it doesn't seem like he's wholly driven to do this thing. And so there is such a difference between the two. I think it's a great re-envisioning of the original story without being the original story. I see more differences than parallels. I don't know about you guys. I also see, there's the obvious thing here that in the first Rocky, Apollo Creed called Rocky the kind of the great white hope, right? He called him, he said he was the white figure that he needed, and they mentioned the race part of it quite a bit. And this is, you know, obviously bringing up in boxing's past that when Jack Johnson took the title in 1908, that they needed a great white hope, and all of this racial strife that goes on through boxing's history. And now we have this reimagining of the story through the black lens. And what's interesting is so many times Hollywood can take a black hero and hit the stereotypes and the cliches, and it just feels forced. And this is clearly written, as Brad talked about, from a black man's perspective. Coogler takes the pen and takes it, and to a lot of credit for Sly, he steps into the background of this story. He gives up his entire franchise to a pretty much unproven director. Up until this point, Ryan Coogler had only done Fruitvale Station, which was an amazing story of Oscar Grant. You should go watch that one if you haven't. And I watched that movie, and I knew he was going to do great things. But most people watch this and say, like, yeah, okay, that's a good movie, but who knows? You know, who knows with this Coogler guy? And he hands over a rich franchise of 6 movies to an unproven director, and not only directing, but also writing. And he lets him tell it from the black perspective. And what I thought was fascinating, did you guys see that Muhammad Ali watched Rocky II with Roger Ebert in Muhammad Ali's mansion? Did you ever see this article?
No.
This happened. Okay, so Roger Ebert, you know I have to do a Roger Ebert shout out in every appearance of the On Repeat podcast. So I found this article. You guys should go look it up. That Muhammad Ali invited Roger over to his house to watch to watch Rocky II. Okay, and they both sit down and watch it, and they both talk about how Ali is just overwhelmingly praising of Carl Weathers' performance of Apollo Creed, because he is Muhammad Ali. He's basically Muhammad Ali. And there's a really good Atlantic article that touches on this, and they said that he is like the embodiment of Ali. He's a barely concealed stand-in for Muhammad Ali, is their quote. And he goes through the whole thing talking about how, you know, Weathers gets it right, and he looks like him, and he does things that are actual boxing. And, you know, Sly Stallone doesn't really do a lot of real boxing things. But, you know, America needs this guy to win. And so when they watch at the end, and obviously Rocky wins at the end of number 2, and he actually wins legitimate this time. And here's the quote that Ali said. You ready for this? For a black man to come out superior would be against America's teachings. I have been so great in boxing, they had to create an image like Rocky, a white image on the screen to counteract my image in the ring. America has to have its white images, no matter where it gets them. Jesus, Wonder Woman, Tarzan, and Rocky. End quote. Which is fascinating because 3 of those 4 people were not white. So, I mean, to whitewash the history of everything is such an American idea as well. So talking about race, obviously, in this Black Lives Matter, George Floyd moment of history is interesting because Coogler was able to take something that was such an American whitewashed moment, a touchstone of white masculinity, right? That we needed a great white hope in boxing, and the fictional figure of Rocky becomes that for us even more than the actual figures did. And he takes and reimagines in something to is more of a multicultural moment, and specifically through the Black experience. I thought it was really well done from that lens.
I think it's also important to look at some other moments that happen, where the first fight we actually see in the film is in Tijuana. And when we end up in the final fight, if you look at like the ring advertisements, it's Tecate, where recognizing that boxing as a sport now, it's a different demographic and different market. And I think like it was honest to that. And if you go to the fact that then we end up in London, if we end up in England, that's where I think my reading of some of the like bastard son of England comes in, and some of that American dream stuff comes in, is because why is that where we end up, right? So Stallone had an interview where he talked about how Philadelphia is the place of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, right? The birthplace of the nation. But then everything ended up in New York and Massachusetts, like then Virginia. And so Philadelphia felt left behind. And I think there's a lot of ways where you could look at Adonis as being left behind. I think you could look at the original Rocky movies as these places where like the blue collar white worker felt left behind in those time periods because the economic structure of kind of the Americas had changed. And that steel, labor, those ideas that like are rooted on Philly and Pittsburgh, right? Like there's a reason that the Philadelphia Eagles, they boo Santa Claus, right? The Steelers, like there's a fan base that is almost ravenous in those cities, because it is hard work, it's determination, it's grit. And so I think that Philadelphia is a really important character in this Creed movie. And that to me is where a lot of the separation of Rocky and Creed occurs. This is a different Philadelphia, in my opinion. And it comes down to the way that I think Philadelphia is maybe represented. You see Adonis wearing this 24 jacket in Roman numerals, which is a Kobe Bryant reference. Like one of these sons of Philadelphia, Kobe Bryant. If you listen to the soundtrack, you have Meek Mills. If you go to the clubs where Bianca is playing, right, we are seeing the culture of Philadelphia from a different lens. And where in Rocky, his training going the distance moment is going up the steps at the art museum. To me, the version of that here, and it might be a little corny, is the dirt bike moment. And that's something that's laid out to us a little bit earlier for those of us that don't really understand this kind of like niche culture. But Rocky's no longer there. He's not running with the van. He's by himself. And then the city rises up behind him. And it's not about your father. It's not about yourself. It's about the support. And he's being supported by sort of the working class of Philadelphia. and I don't know if you watch Queer Eye on Netflix, but the most recent season is taking place in Philadelphia. And a lot of the like reoccurring concept in this season is about the gentrification of, or the whitewashing of Philadelphia. And so I think getting to see more of that authentic, these are the places that aren't on the tours. These are the places that maybe the airport isn't going to highlight. And that to me is a place that makes this a richer, more independent, a more authentic voice than the original Rocky did, where Philadelphia and the original Rocky felt like a backstop. And instead, to me, this felt like a living, breathing entity. And so that's a place where I kind of separate the two, is the way that I think the setting works.
You guys have me wondering, talking about the whitewashing, talking about Muhammad Ali's quote, and then talking earlier about why is boxing not as popular now? Is there an argument to be made that it is because it has become a black and brown man's sport? I mean, I'm not saying there are no white people that do it. But, there's arguments about, well, it's desperate people, it's poverty, it's this, it's that. But to hear you, Paul, talk about Muhammad Ali saying they had to fictionalize a character to generate the publicity around this, that is the premise of Rocky, is that Apollo is saying, hey, I have to have this guy in order to get it. You think of in real life, Floyd Mayweather went to, the McGregor, who wasn't even a boxer, to generate. So it's interesting to me that this is coming up, and race is clearly a part of this, and has been a challenge to some of the Rocky movies, because first it was Apollo, and Rocky 3, it's Clubber Lang, and how some of these things are portrayed. And Rocky 3, although it took some hits on that racial line, also has, in some ways, the black savior, because it's Apollo who in so many ways rescues Rocky. So, it's interesting that this series has some things where it does, I guess, raise some interesting questions as far as how it deals with race, and how boxing deals with race as even a sport.
We see some moments too where a white man, the English Pretty Ricky, wants to use Creed. We see that with Leo the Lion and his dad. They want to use Creed. That it's not about we're all on the same team, but we get a moment of we're all on the same team in the second gym with the sparring partner, where amongst two black men, right? That Rocky stops and says, like, no, this is a battle we are fighting together. When those two characters get a little kind of chippy with each other. And so I do think that there are undertones, or maybe they're just tones, of seeing kind of the inherent racism in sport or in society, of using other people to our advantage instead of trying to build everybody up. And I think one of the cool things about Creed is it references that third fight between Apollo and Rocky that we don't ever see. And the fact that, like, that fight was just for them. That fight was to see who the better fighter was. It wasn't for the prize or the payday. It wasn't for the sport. It was for them. And that's a really subtle nod, I think, that is pretty thematic in terms of the kind of like racial things that are happening in the film, but also those things that are kind of like the spiritual, emotional, that some fights we fight are for our inside. And that's one of those things that I think, again, makes this so worth a revisit, because it's about the inner work. It's about catharsis. In boxing, once again, like why it lends itself to film is because there are times where we feel we deserve to get the crap kicked out of us. And that's the thing that sometimes makes us feel like we'll feel better, and we don't. Or I'm feeling this internal pain, so like this outward pain is going to match with that. And I think that boxing does that really well sometimes and really poorly sometimes on screen. And that's one of the things I really liked about Creed is it wasn't playing up the character as a glutton for punishment. He was trying to do something with his own name and legacy that happened to be punishing. But a lot of the focus on how it was framed on the screen was about him building himself. And so like the fact that there weren't 45 bouts, that we're not seeing him get knocked down time and time again, and that the focus is on the training, the mentorship, and the building, I think really shifts how boxing can be positively portrayed, because it is about grit, it's determination. Any like going the distance sport can be about suffering, or it can be about the self-improvement that happens through pain and hard work.
Yeah. And you talked some about like how he needs, how he's, how Adonis is kind of that humanizing character. Like that was one of my favorite parts of this movie is I feel more connected to Adonis than I did Rocky in the first Rocky film. I don't know about you guys, but like he's so much more humanized. He's so much more fleshed out. Like when he has that fight with the guy at Bianca's show, right? And come get this pic for the gram for me. And then, baby Creed and, as part of it is maybe we need to show him as like the toxic masculinity ego check thing, he gets in a big fight. But then, part of it is like, he has a lot of flaws. And, in the first Rocky, the only flaws I see in him is he's just kind of, he's kind of a blockhead. And he seems to like this lady who I can't really seem to find any connection between the two. And he keeps around Paulie, who I definitely would not have kept around. So, I mean, he has flaws in the people he surrounds himself with. But, Rocky is just not as humanized. He almost feels like a caricature, of a boxer. Whereas Adonis feels like a real person. He feels human. He feels like, and to your point, Brad, like this, they don't focus on the boxing matches. They focus on humanizing him. Those moments where he's with Bianca and they're having that conversation, sitting down, eating food for the first time. And that's a long scene. What I noticed in the rewatch of this is how Coogler breaks up the scenes so nicely. It's like a series of music videos. None of them are more than 3 or 4 minutes. And he does such a good job at pacing. And he'll have an action scene and then a dialogue scene and then a music montage scene, and they're all put together so nicely. And then that scene where they sit down and talk probably takes 8-9 minutes, and he switches up the angles and he does things to keep you interested. But that scene is so important, and he realizes I can't just cut this to 3 minutes. There's no way. I got so much more humanizing to give to these two characters. And it's not just about Adonis, because we want to humanize Bianca too, and they talked about that in the making of it. They didn't want to make her like Adrian, who's just kind of an afterthought and just kind of Rocky's support staff. Bianca has a story too, and she's got her own deal, her own issues she's dealing with. And the way that those characters are humanized, and I feel a connection to them, the way that they have ups and downs and ebbs and flows throughout the movie, it just makes it. I really like the way they wrote the story.
And Paul, to your point about like when he goes and punches the other performer that's going to perform with Bianca or going to be the actual attraction there, that's even humanizing him too, because he's coming right from finding out about Rocky's cancer. And so, and then that's even how he explains it to Bianca, not to make excuses, but I just found this out. And that's when Bianca lets him in because, and going back to Brad's point, and this all connects because Rocky has become this pseudo father figure for, Adonis. And it was right before that Rocky said, we're not a real family. And that's what sent Adonis into this spiral. And then who is he? He's the same little kid from the beginning that's going to go pick a fight with somebody because it's fight or flight for him, and he's just been abandoned. Nobody's in his corner, and then after that they reunite, and now we're ready to go.
When Rocky says we're not a real family, one of the really good notes that I loved was included is we see Rocky sit down and reflect on that. and realize that he said something out of emotion and passion that he doesn't believe. And in terms of the human characters, this is the most human version of the Rocky character I think that we've ever seen. I think Rocky Balboa played up him as father and character a little bit more. And so I think that the really nice thing, it's hard to talk about Rocky and Sylvester Stallone and separate them, because our first real introduction to Sylvester Stallone as an actor is Rocky. And there are idiosyncrasies. There's so much overlap. But then you get movies like maybe like Demolition Man, where you realize like, okay, Rocky and Sly they're different. But it's really hard to separate them because Sylvester Stallone has played Rocky so often and for so long.
Yeah.
And so recognizing like, oh, this guy is actually acting. He's not just playing himself is a hard thing to do. And I think maybe it would be more fair to view this film if I were to watch some of those 90s Rambo, like any of those films, because then you realize like, okay, just because he is forever linked with this character, he is acting to play this character. And there are connections, and it is based on aspects of him. But I look at it and I think, man, Sylvester Stallone definitely deserved that Academy Award nomination. That to me is a place where, like, when you look at some of those longer monologues based on how the character had been framed out in those previous 6 movies, this is good acting.
That part you referenced where he's sitting down, he's saying, "What'd you do? What'd you do? Why'd I say that?" And then the part where he is having that conversation about the cancer with him, and he stares back at the wall and points at it and says, "Those people are in the past. You got to go in the future." And like those 2 moments are his Oscar moments for sure. Like that's the part they clip out and put right in front of the nomination at the award show, right? But like you watch those moments and that's real acting. And I don't know if we've ever seen real acting from the previous 6 movies. I don't even know Rocky Balboa. Like, yeah, that one probably is the most human performance, but he is so wooden and stiff the entire franchise. And to your point, and in all the action movies of the 80s and 90s too, we see him acting. And I don't know if it was the loss of his son and he kind of channeled that into this role. I don't know if it was him finally giving up the reins to Coogler and being directed rather than trying to do it himself. I don't know if the script obviously is a good one, but he got the Oscar nomination, and he lost to Mark Rylance in 2015 for the movie Bridge of Spies. You talk about Oscar travesties. I'm just going to leave that right there. That's not good.
The other really human thing, because you guys brought up when Adonis punches Tone Trump, who is another Philadelphia rapper. I think it's important that we realize that people have triggers, right? That we have things that will set us off, that there is that button where if you say that one thing, whether it's your friends or whether it's your family or whether it's your significant other, but there's a thing where we have just that hair trip trigger where if somebody says it, it flips. And so the fact that Adonis is what it is, the fact that he is going up against another kind of big personality, the fact that it's right after the scene with Rocky and the diagnosis, this is the perfect storm. And that to me is another one of those really human moments where what you say isn't really what you say that matters. It's what you say in the context of what I'm feeling and when and where and all of that information. And then trying to reconcile and talk your way out of that where you know that you exploded and we're completely in the wrong, but how do I explain my visceral animalistic action? Because all of the work I've done as a person was to avoid that. and I failed. How do I tell the person I love and I care about that I'm a failure and I still need all this work? When he says, I need you right now, or don't shut me out, it's so sympathetic, but also you're like angry with him because why did you act that way? But you also know completely why he acted that way. Like it's these layers of emotion that do feel so real, and you can put yourself in those shoes because you've had that moment and you've needed somebody, but you pushed them away because of things that were 20, 30 years old that came boiling up to the surface in a moment. Like, to me, that was one of those things that was so humanistic and so truthful. And maybe it felt cliche because it's two African-American men in the backstage of a rap show. And the fact that the fact that there's a moment where Adonis comes out to a Tupac song, right? Like, I think speaks to that idea of some of the toxic masculinity in culture. But it's so much more than that. It's having these deep rooted emotional triggers and not having a support system where you can share them and talk through them and healthily work through them. And so what we see is the unhealthy version. And I think this movie does a good job of not celebrating that, but recognizing this is unhealthy. This is not sustainable. You will lose your career. You will lose your woman. You will ruin your woman's chances. Like, those moments of this behavior is problematic is what I think is amazing in this movie. Is it's not celebrating, as a lot of other movies do, problematic masculine behavior. It is saying, dude, you've got to learn and grow, and you don't have to do this alone.
So you got all of that out of Michael B. Jordan's performance, which is a lot. So clearly, I would guess you would say he did a good job in that. Anybody that knows me knows I have a man crush for this guy. Michael B. Jordan is my hero. I first got in contact with him in the Bill Simmons podcast. He did it right before he recorded released Fruitvale Station, and then I watched that movie, and I was instantly hooked in his talents. So coming off of the Sly Stallone conversation, what do you guys think about Michael B. Jordan's performance? Does it hold up to Sly Stallone's performance when they're on the screen together? Are they trading blows? Is one overwhelming the other? Because we think that his performance was worthy of an Oscar nomination, but Michael B. Jordan really comes into like superstardom with this movie and becomes a household name.
Yeah, I think his performance is really good, and I think of just different scenes. I think of the one where he seemingly is almost aloof, like he's just helping Unc, as he calls him, unload the food from the truck, and he only seems like half interested, and it's just almost lighthearted. But then I think of the scene in the Delphi gym where he fights the other fighters, which I would like to get to that scene because I have a problem with that scene. But when he fights the other guys in the Delphi gym and he yells, like, did you grow up in group homes? Did you ever miss a meal? Like, he shows this intensity. And I think in this movie, you get to see a range that, to your point earlier, you don't often see in the Rocky series. And I think Michael B. Jordan does it really well, showing, I can be a human, I can be an intense fighter, and you see why I am those things. I'm not just, as you said earlier, I'm not just a caricature. I'm a human with different ranges of emotion. So to me, he captures that.
When you're named Michael Jordan
after the GOAT,
there's a lot of pressure. And not a stage name. He is Michael B. Jordan. And I think it's really interesting that you have an actor named Michael Jordan playing a role about names and legacies, because I can only see him as an actor as a rising star. And if you look at some of the past things he did, like Friday Night Lights and the Fantastic Four, like, they weren't great, But once he started to get opportunities to have more of a dramatic range, you could see all of the greatness that Michael B. Jordan is destined for. And I think like my first introduction was Friday Night Lights, which is a really good football movie. It is a very formulaic, I think, football television show, like trying to go back to the well. And I mean, I never felt like I was the intended audience for that show. But Michael B. Jordan's performance on it was a moment where you're like, this guy is destined for some things, and he can make you feel. What I think he did really, really well was eye contact. That in the scenes where he's asking for help with Rocky, unloading the truck, he doesn't really make eye contact with Rocky. And like, it's hard for him to ask for help. And so there are these really subtle nods, I think, that are the way that these things would play out in real life. That when you're asking for help and it's hard, you can't look in the eye because you don't feel comfortable doing it, right? You're not respecting yourself. You should be able to do it alone. And so his eyes, like the way that he would face or frame with other characters, those were things that really, really impressed me. Beyond the physical shape he had to get in, beyond the training, beyond the fight things, right? Beyond the physical preparation to play the role that he played, the acting in those really sentimental, emotional scenes felt like real sentiment. It didn't feel like saccharine or fake. And I think a lot of times in sports movies, it feels cheesy, it feels corny, or whatever food words you want to plug in. And I felt like I was in for the emotion. And sometimes it was uncomfortable because I felt like I was watching something intimate that I shouldn't be privy to. I think he crushes it.
That's a great scene that you both mentioned, was the one where he's helping him unload the food, because yeah, like you make a great point. Like he's just head down doing the thing, even though he's there to ask for help, right? He should be connecting with this guy. And then at the end, you know, he's like, he's writing down the plan, and he's like, you know, they're trying to, oh, is that an N? Like he asks for like his handwriting, and then he won't even take the sheet of paper from him, right? And then they make the interesting, you know, generational joke about the cloud, which I think is fun, but it is like, it is a bigger thing, right? That he doesn't even want the sheet of paper. He's just like there, and he's out, like, and he's running as he's leaving, right? And that whole idea of, yeah, his acting is different in all those different aspects of the film, and it does develop over time. And obviously, yeah, he got in incredible shape, and he did what I like to call the Tom Cruise, where he, you know, Cruise learned how to be a bartender and fly a helicopter and drive a race car. So yeah, I mean, he actually learned how to box. There are no body doubles. He was training for a whole year to do this movie. It looks amazing. If you want to look up on YouTube, people, go pause this right now. He actually took the hit that is the slow motion shot where he falls down to the canvas in the last, in all of the Rocky movies up to this point. Sly told him in the development of this movie, he said, I took at least one real shot in all the development of this movie. You know, that's such a masculine move to just drop that line in there. Hey, just so you know, in all the previous 6 movies. So he said, if you can do it, I can do it. And so there's actual YouTube footage of him taking that punch from Pretty Ricky, and it's legit, man. He takes it. He like turns his head into it and then spits as he falls, and it's legit. So Michael B. Jordan, here's to you, buddy.
Well, and Pretty Ricky is played by an actual former boxer. Mm-hmm. You know, that's one thing that's interesting about the Rocky series. The guy that played, his name like Duke or something, that was Apollo Creed's trainer, is an actual former boxer. Like it's ridden with this, even the actors, which I find fascinating.
And that's, first of all, I think Michael B. Jordan is a phenomenal actor. If I got punched by a boxer, I would look like I got punched by a boxer when I took a real take too. So I'm going to discredit that one, because when you're like, oh, and he spit.
The fact that he did it.
Touche.
Knowing what he knows about CTE is pretty impressive. It was different in the 70s.
The authenticity of this film by having real boxers as the opponents, I think, is a thing that definitely separates from some of the weaker films in the Rocky titular franchise. Bringing in Hulk Hogan as Thunder Lips, bringing in Mr. T as Clubber Lang, that to me felt like a cash grab, and it felt like gimmick. And so having these actors, I'm going to say, who are really athletes, oftentimes that can go really wrong when you don't have people who are trained actors trying to play roles. And I felt like by playing versions of themselves, it never felt like it crossed that line. And so as we're moving forward, one of the things that I really liked here was the cultural relevancy of blending reality with the cinematic world. And so I loved the HBO Sports interstitial. There's something about Liev Schreiber's voice where he could narrate anything.
Yep.
But the 24/7 boxing show, I've watched those without ever watching the match, because there is a great narrative structure. The fact that it's Bruce Buffer and he's doing the call and you get the "let's get ready to rumble." The fact that I know Bruce Buffer by name and didn't have to look that up, the thing that
Kellerman's another good one.
Yeah.
Right. And so where you could have narrator, the fact that you're using announcing, that's a great trope. I loved PTI being in there. And if you look at the scroll on PTI, it is Patriots, Eagles, Tyson, Tiger, LeBron, and then Tebow.
Tebow.
I love that, with the exception of Tebow, when we think about things that hold up, you should be able to watch this movie in 10 years, 20 years, and you're going to know, hopefully, Tyson and Tiger, LeBron. You'll know about the Patriots during this time period. And that to me is a really cool thing. And it doesn't feel forced because Tebow's in there as well, where you're like, oh, let me Wikipedia or whatever Wikipedia is going to be in 2043. So how did you guys feel that the real world blended with this cinematic world?
I did really like how just the narrative structure of watching that HBO thing, and he's learning about that fighter as we're learning about it. And then they show just a little glimpse of the iPad afterward. And it's like, oh, well, he was watching that with us. They did a similar move when you guys were talking about how great Felicia Rashad is. They're watching, we're watching the match start to get ready at the end. And then it pops the screen out into a flat screen TV on a wall. And then we see her watching the film, the show, and then it goes back into it. So in just a brief moment, we know that she's watching at the same time. And we don't have to interrupt the story structure of her having a moment where she's, oh, I'm so scared. Oh, and so the ways that Coogler puts those moments in, I love the way that they had that conversation at the very beginning, the opening scene, and little child Adonis says, well, what was his name? And then bam, hit the title screen with the word Creed on it. So just the way that he kind of fit those kind of real life things into it, and hit it in the story structure along with the pace of the story, and didn't have to stop and pause and tell us things. It was, it was such a really, his greatest strength. I mean, he's great behind the camera, but I think his greatest strength is telling a story and doing it with minimal interruptions and being able to layer lots of pieces of information into it without feeling forced.
The only thing I didn't like is I don't like when they showed a boxer and then they paused and put his video game stats.
Video game.
I did not like that. But I also did appreciate, I guess, that he's got to communicate in some way who these people are, and I don't want a 10-minute introduction to them. I don't know that I needed, and I'll go ahead and make my point from earlier. My problem with the scene with Adonis in the Delphi gym, so he gets in there, he makes the bet, anybody who lands a headshot gets my car. He then fights according to his video game stats, a 2010 Golden Glove champ, the number 6 ranked fighter in the world, and knocks him out in 10 seconds. And then he fights against Danny Wheeler And while he gets his butt kicked, the bed also changed, I guess, because it goes from headshot. Adonis gets hit in the head like 6 times, and then he gets knocked out. But then after getting knocked out, the leader of the Delphi gym comes over and is like, "See, you know, you'll never, you're stubborn. You always got to learn your way." He just beat, without any training, he just beat the number 6 ranked guy in the world, and then immediately fought the number 2 ranked. And we're not impressed by that. Instead, we're thinking that he is lost and he's pathetic. So that part I didn't, that's my biggest quip with the movie. But those video game stats I found troublesome in some ways.
Yeah, I wanted him to fight some people that were of good quality, but I don't know how he would have told that story without having that moment in there, So I bet he really stopped and paused, because that's the only time that happens in the whole movie. So he probably was like, do I really want to do this? This is so different stylistically, right? The video game is kind of an interesting way to think of it. I was
worried. The first time I saw the movie, I was worried. I thought they were going to do more of that in the film. And I do remember feeling that way. And then they don't.
That stylistically feels more like Creed 2, where it's like more in your face, and I didn't like that as much. But yeah, I think my only problem was it was so much information. Like, you couldn't have just had like 2 things. They had like all the nicknames and stuff. Like, I don't need to know his nickname. Like, why does that
matter? One of my favorite things about boxing is the spectacle. That is one of the and it's why I think I like professional wrestling. It's because I'm going to change that, past tense, why I liked professional wrestling.
You got to keep some cred here.
The idea of entrance music, the idea of the spectacle of dimming the lights, and you can choreograph the nickname, and then you're about to do something that is just grit, sheer will, and determination. The blending of those 2 worlds of the over the top spectacle against something that is so dirty and gritty, I love the idea of these nicknames that don't, like the Bank, Stuntman, to me, that's an important aspect, because you are a persona when you step into the ring, right? That you have to shed some aspects of reality to do that. You have to put the risks aside, because you could, like Apollo, lose your life. Like Rocky, you could lose some of your cognition. And so being able to step into another persona, I think, is a really cool thing, maybe about the psychology of the sport. And so what I liked about it is I find the nicknames kind of enjoyable. It's one of those things where it's like, I spent 20 minutes after watching this looking through a list of the best boxing nicknames, and Iron Mike Tyson, where it's like, Iron Mike could be better.
Well, let's talk about Hollywood then. Could be better.
Yes, for sure.
And if this is a movie about making your own name, shedding Hollywood and becoming Creed, where I loved that what was his name, and then we get the title card. I think this movie could have been one of the rare movies that ends with the title card and credits. And normally that's a gimmick that I don't like. But if the whole movie is about him becoming Creed, I think that would have been a really cool move. And so I loved the fact that when it came to the shorts, on the front it says Creed, right? Your opponent is looking at the name of your father. You have that credibility. And then if it's about you building a fan base and respect and you're earning your own name, all of the fans, the cameras, the viewers see Johnson. And so that was a really cool storytelling moment that I really, really liked. They only called him Hollywood twice. But yes, garbage nickname.
He should have been the love child.
Adonis the Bastard Creed. If we're talking about quibbles, if we can get there.
Let's get there.
I think, I don't know. I know Coogler had a tall task to tell a story about an illegitimate child of Apollo, and then to do it in a way that flipped this whole, as we talked about, whitewashed mechanic of the Rocky franchise. So the first thing he had to break down was the idea that Apollo was just a friend to Rocky. He had to build him up as a legend in boxing. But what's interesting, as I watched all 6 movies, is that Apollo really wasn't that. He was a champion in the first 2 movies, and he was well respected, and Rocky didn't want to go in the ring with him in either of the first 2 movies. But then he retires, and he was kind of an afterthought from 3 till Balboa. In fact, in Rocky Balboa, there's this digital media video fight between him and Mason the Line Dixon, and they talk about how Rocky is, the greatest fighter of all time, right? And his video version beats him, and that's what inspires the final fight of Rocky's career. So the fact that then they come in and Creed, and Bianca's kind of sitting in the window, and Rocky's picking up Adonis from the apartment, and hey, I'm going to go live with my cousin. She's like, you could have told me your cousin was Rocky Balboa. Okay, so that was her reaction to Rocky, right? And then her reaction when she figures out that his father is Adonis Creed, she's like, what? Flipping out, like almost break up. Like, it's like, you're not keeping it 100 with me. Like the greatest boxer of all time, I think she even mentions or something. So like everybody just agrees that Apollo was like the great. And Rocky is just an afterthought. He's just like this guy. And if you watch some of the old Rocky movies, he's like stopped constantly in the Philadelphia streets. Like it's a big point of contention in the 5th one because his son is, in Philadelphia. And so like he's an icon. He has a statue, he has the whole thing. But yet he's just kind of like, he's left behind in this movie. And he makes that point, right? That everything died and I'm left behind. But now Apollo is like this great figure. And I realize why they had to do it, but narrative-wise, I'm really struggling.
I think that's a great point. I also think that's, to your point, Paul, in Rocky IV, that's part of the reason why Apollo Creed wants to fight Ivan Drago is he feels, I don't have, that's easy for you to say, Rocky, I don't have what you have. I don't have the legacy that you have. And so I agree. I thought the same thing when they now say like Apollo is one of the greatest of all time, and PTI, saying that, it's just like, well, that's not really how the first movies set it up. I would agree with you. And I would also argue it's not needed. I mean, he didn't have to be one of the best. He was a heavyweight champ. That should have been enough for them to make the movie what it was. He didn't have to be one of the best of all time. Everybody knew who Apollo Creed was. He was a heavyweight champ at one time.
To play devil's advocate, looking at this like based in this realistic world, minus the fact that we get video game stats, that does bug me because it does break the like verisimilitude of the world a little bit. I think it's Wilbon who is celebrating Apollo, and the fact that Bianca is celebrating Apollo, that part of me wonders if this is a posthumous lift up of Apollo and a revisiting of the work. Right. And then looking at like, okay, now with some more distance, were we giving him the fair share? Was Apollo, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe some martyr complex too. I mean, the idea that he died early always lifts your status versus Rocky living into his elderly years, right? Go ahead.
He wasn't provided with the same opportunities or matches as Rocky because he was a black man. Right, looking at the neighborhoods where he's being spoken about and who speaks about him. And so is this a Bird Johnson discussion, right, where we have Boston and LA making that argument, and who is making that argument? Is it because of the fact that Rocky's career continued and didn't end at his prime? Right. So I think that like there are aspects that we can look at and maybe look at Apollo differently. We're also viewing Apollo only through the Rocky lens. And I know that boxers aren't fighting multiple fights in a year, right? Like they're not fighting 8 or 10. It's maybe 1 or 2 because they're training for 6 months. But maybe there is something we don't know that's being left out. But he is always kind of set up as the champion or number 2 in Rocky is better. But that introduction of the third fight that Apollo won seems to be something in the boxing community that is spoken about or known about maybe a little bit, or at least in Rocky's circle, that might bring up Apollo a little bit. If he beat Rocky twice.
Yeah. The only other quibble I had was, I noticed, you know how much I love Michael B. Jordan, but there's this moment where he finally decides to go and fight Pretty Ricky Conlon, which is a completely made-up fictional character. And he does this move where there's, I don't know, they're in like the down cellar of Adrian's restaurant, right? And they're standing there talking, and Rocky walks away, and Michael B. Jordan turns and says, "I'm fighting Pretty Ricky Conlon." He does like this big scream. You guys know this moment? And then that's the end of the scene. Like that was rough. That is not going to be on your Oscar.
I actually wanted him to do just the opposite. I wanted him to say it and then to repeat it again with fear. Because like his whole thing when they had the meeting the day before with Conlon's promoter, and he asked Rocky, "Do you think I'm ready?" And Rocky says, "The only reason they're here is because they know you're not ready." So I wanted him to say, "Hey, this is awesome. I get to fight the heavyweight champ of the world." And then all of a sudden to have this like, crap, I have to go fight the heavyweight champ of the world and I know I'm not ready. I wish they would have played it that way, because I agree with you. It was kind of this cheesy, weird moment that didn't build anything.
And to your point, like, couldn't he yelled, "I'm fighting the heavyweight champ of the world"? Like, that has more interesting compellingness to it than Pretty Ricky Conlon. Like, this is completely fictional name. I don't know if they needed to drive home that was his name, or I don't know.
Yeah.
At that point of the script, it was weird.
Yeah, that was not a great moment. And it's one where it felt theatrical. It didn't feel cinematic. I didn't feel like it advanced anything.
What is Conlon going to prison for, by the way?
Gun charges.
Is that all it says, just gun charges?
They do it like his promoter brings it up and calls him an idiot. And there's another father-son dynamic between him and the promoter a little bit. He's going to be leaving his kids behind, which is another one of those things.
Yep.
But I don't know. It just like 7 years for an unregistered weapon.
Right.
But it's England, man. They don't mess
England.
around.
That's true. In America, that's just another Tuesday.
One of my quibbles, and I've got a couple things and they're little. I'm nitpicking. I loved the old boxing posters. Like those just felt super authentic. Like old concert and boxing posters are just kind of like a cool art form I really like. But one of them says Rocky, the Italian stallion, and Italian is in quotes. Stallion is not. And this just bothers me as an English teacher because Rocky is literally an Italian and in no way, shape, or form a stallion. And so it just feels like very poor use of quotes. It bothers me when Adonis is going for his late night jog and he jogs past the club and he sees Bianca's poster. So you're telling me he just has his ID and cover charge in that Nike sweatsuit? Bothers me. The other is Adonis has a mattress on the floor, but is watching the HBO 24/7 on his iPad. And I know he has to still be using his mom's login.
Yeah, for sure.
But for me, if you're going to make it on your own, bud, you can't be using other people's passwords. And those are very little things, and they're dumb. But it's like, okay, you have a mattress on the floor, but you have HBO. And maybe that's how invested he is in boxing, that like those are the sacrifices he makes. But there are just like little things like that where I'm like smirking because it's just kind of the reality blends a little bit. Dave, you got any more nitpicks? Sorry.
No, that was really my main one. Was just the Delphi gym. You know, that whole scene I find. I mean, I understand the need for it, but and obviously he has to be motivated to go out east and find Rocky. But like the idea that Duke's son, who's the same actor from Remember the Titans, right?
I trainer. Tell you.
I think that trainer is in Remember the Titans. I think he's the other defensive end. But the idea when he says, like, not only am I not going to train you, but I'm going to make sure that nobody trained you. Like, I didn't, what? Why? Like, why is he so invested in making sure that Adonis never fights? So that some of that stuff I didn't really understand. I thought they did a good job in the HBO special part, Brad, of playing up that the Delphi gym is where, Apollo trained. And, but early on, the idea that, like, I think it's Danny Greer, one of them says, hey, you need to listen to your family. He actually says that as if that trainer, Duke's son, and Adonis have some connection. And none of that got played up enough for me to feel like there was any connection there. For me I had to listen closely to even figure out that was supposed to be the son of the guy that played Apollo by that point in the movie. So I think some of those things, could have been maybe better handled. But my main quibble with that scene is just the idea that nobody's impressed by the fact that Adonis goes in there without any training, any technical training, just defeated the number 6 ranked guy in the world. Because evidently if you get beat by number 2, then you suck.
If I'm not ranked and I beat 6, I stop there. I've won my bet. I've just boxed. Where in the boxing world do you go like next? It's not
exactly.
You're not,
we don't just run the table. There's a boxing movie, Paul. Have you ever seen the movie Griggstown? Is that the name of it?
No. What is that one?
Oh, you got to check that one out. They do what Paul said. Like, he has to fight like 20 fights in 24 hours.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That's you gotta put that one on next. I might have that title wrong. I'll find out.
So let's talk about some of the one-liners, and we'll do like what holds up at the same time. So like one of the things that I really liked about what holds up is athletes owning restaurants in retirement. Like I think that that's going to go for forever. So if you want to work in some of the lines you really liked or some of the just general concepts that you think are going to age well, what do you got?
I love the constant repeated line of, what is it, 1 step, 1 punch, 1 round. And just this idea that we're going to keep moving forward, which is another reference to a Rocky line from past. They're kind of great for these one-line moments. I thought that was a good one. By the way, real quick, it's Diggstown is the name of the movie with James Wood and Louis Gossett Jr. So you got to check that out.
Deep cut boxing movies.
Yeah.
That's the B-sides right there. I don't know what age the best for me, other than just like rebooting a franchise, which is really hard to do. I mean, like, I'm super excited. They just announced Creed 3 is going to come out. Don't know if you guys saw that. Probably not for a super long time, considering the way they can film things, but that's definitely happening. I don't know. It's just like the ending scene was interesting to me with the Rocky steps. And I was interested because I watched, all 8 of them. So when they'd get to the top of the Rocky steps in some of the films, the Rocky statue would be there. And the Rocky statue got unveiled at the beginning of number 3, and it was a plot point. And then at they get to the top of the steps in this last one, the Rocky statue's not there. And so many different ones, it is there, it's not there. And so I had to look it up. And there's like all kinds of controversy in Philadelphia about whether this thing should be up or not. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It's fascinating. People think that it's just a movie prop and it's a fictional character. So why the heck is it cluttering our town? And so they moved it out to the Spectrum when that was the arena for the Sixers, and then they moved it into storage for a while. It wasn't even available, and now it's out by the Museum of Art, and it's not actually at the top of the steps. They do move it over to the steps sometimes to film things, and then they put it back. So it's fascinating that, you know, the steps have become such an icon, and Rocky himself as a fictional character has become such an icon. But there is still pushback in this idea of, you know, all the baggage that he brings with that, right? The toxic masculinity, the fact that he's a fictional character and they're not actually celebrating their real heroes. It took them till 2015 to build a statue of Joe Frazier, their actual Philadelphia hero. So there's all these problems, you know, that come with that statue, but it's so iconic and the steps are so iconic that, I don't know, they'll live on forever.
I think
well, and to me, it's kind of, go ahead, Brad.
I think it's a plot point in Rocky Balboa that they talk about the statue being taken down. Like, I thought that was something that was mentioned, and that was part of his like diminished legacy. And then I think it's back up at the bottom of the steps. So I thought like they did try to address that. But even if it's gone, it seems like the ending of this movie is about Rocky, the person, being able to make it up the steps, and it's less about the legacy being ingrained. That the legacy lives on through your action, not through the memorials, I guess. And I think that's a really important thing now, where we're looking at memorials and we're looking at these statues, and it's really about like, what legacy, what did you do, as opposed to what artwork stands. So I think that they addressed it, but I agree with you too, that it is kind of an interesting thing outside of the frame of the movie of what we celebrate and who we celebrate, and do we celebrate reality or do we celebrate the fictional worlds that portray our cities well? So Dave, what were you gonna say?
Well, that's the thing. I was just going to say that I think for me, the Rocky franchise has done more for Philadelphia, made me want to go there, made me want a cheesesteak, more than Joe Frazier. I'm not saying that Joe Frazier isn't heroic in his own way. I'm sure he is. But also, I think an unfortunate side of the current political landscape is that, you know, if we're going to celebrate people, we also have to celebrate their parts of their flaws. And I'm not by any means saying that means that we should be celebrating people that were horrible. But I am saying that if you put a statue up of somebody like Joe Frazier, I'm sure there were things, and that comes up in the movie, right, with Apollo, with that PTI debate. You know, does this destroy his legacy? And, you know, ultimately I agree with the guys on there. Like, no, it doesn't. People are flawed. But I do think it's interesting to hear you say that, Paul, because to me, like, I want that statue there because to me that is those steps. That's the only reason I know about those steps is that film. But I also get it that it's a fictional character, but it feels real because we've seen that character not just once, not just twice, but so many times. I mean, our kids are probably going to be watching Pretty Boy Ricky Conlan's son fight Adonis's son in Creed 12.
The fact that the MLB was set to play games at the Field of Dreams field in Iowa, I think speaks to the power of cinematic sport over sport. That hockey on film has always been more powerful, even as a Blackhawks fan, than hockey, right? Like, if it wasn't for Mighty Ducks, I wouldn't be a Blackhawks fan. And so that
one of the coolest things I ever did is I took our team to Hoosier Gym in Indiana, where the movie Hoosiers, that was their hometown gym. And that was really cool. They had a picture of their team, and then they had a picture of the movie team. I was far more interested in getting our picture by the movie team. I don't care about these guys from Indiana.
and that's the benefit, I think, of sports cinema, is it speaks to the things that are powerful about sport and just can magnify them and can get to the heart I know who wins this fight when I watch it the second, third, or fourth time. But I will tell you, I still kind of tear up a little bit. Like that one, and it's in there, and you're like, yeah, he went but you know he's going to do it. You've seen it, and you know how it works out. There are little things beyond that are sprinkled in this movie. I like the Rocky wisdom. Time takes everybody out. It's undefeated. Mm-hmm. And I like that with the bell doesn't mean school's out. Like I like those, and they're balanced really well. Paul, you made reference to the what cloud, and Rocky looks up. The chicken scene where Rocky's like, chickens are slowing down. The motorcycle reference where Rocky says he had a Harley once, but he fell off, so I decided to use my feet. Like that roundness of Rocky where he's wise mentor but also an idiot is great. I love Rocky visiting the grave and bringing Paulie the booze. Yep. And he keeps his chair there and he just sits and reads the paper. Like there's a love for his wife that isn't heavy-handed, but they just kind of share it with you slowly. But probably my favorite subtle, slow moment is winning the first fight. And Adonis says, let's go tear this city up. And then it cuts to 3 pints of Breyer's ice cream and they've fallen asleep watching Skyfall. Like that is just that to me is one of those like realities. Like you're so amped up and then the adrenaline crash. So I really liked that moment. It just little things that I felt were like humanized and rooted in reality. So as we're like wrapping up, I think the final thing we should talk about is where this fits in the Rocky universe, because there are hits and there are misses in the Rocky universe. So Paul, I know that you're pretty passionate and you've got some hot takes about some of the like titular Rocky films. So I'm going to give you some space to rant here. Share your thoughts on the Rocky original series.
Where to begin? Rocky is one of the most iconic Americana movies of all time. And when you watch that first movie from stem to stern, it's like a complete package and it fits and it's everything you would want it to be. And we talked about it has flaws, but I'm not someone as a Michael Jordan over LeBron James person. I'm not someone who thinks the most recent thing we've seen is the greatest thing of all time. And so I generally avoid the idea of, let's remake a classic or let's give it a token sequel because I just want to make some extra cash, right? Those are completely against most of my ideas. But when I watch Rocky 1, and I've seen it many times and I watched it again, it just has so many flaws. And you know, I'm thinking about the time period and I'm thinking about what filmmaking was then, but that director was not good and it was not Sly Stallone. I was a guy who wasn't really big in any other areas. It's just not well directed. The storyline's fine. Rocky's fine. We've already talked about some of his flaws. It has such an important heritage to our country, right? And it has such an important place in, you know, the sports movie landscape and other sort of boxing movie landscapes. But when I look at it compared to this movie, and we're not even going to talk about the sequels, okay? The sequels are bad. Rocky 5 might have been the worst movie I've ever seen. We're not even going to go there. So when we watch Rocky versus Creed, I just sit here and look at Creed and I had a long thought with myself. And I thought, you know what? I really think Creed is a better movie. And that might be blasphemy, but I think Creed is near flawless. And like Ryan Coogler at the helm is so dang good. And just the way that he films things. We didn't even talk about the one shot that he did in that the first actual boxing, the only real boxing match that Adonis has before he goes and fights Pretty Ricky. He films an entire 2-round sequence with a Steadicam and this continuously spinning pan. And then supposedly he filmed it 13 times, and none of it is tricks. He picked the 11th cut and he went with it. And just the way that he can get so much out of it, like when Adonis falls and the whole thing tilts sideways, and the way that he does like these small moves, that just reminds me of in Black Panther when they rotate the screen when Killmonger takes over, and you might remember that part. And like he does so many of these unique things with his style. It's not over aggressive style, but you can tell his style. He has that great pacing. Ryan Coogler is a master. I love this guy so much. I loved Fruitvale Station. I love Black Panther. I will stand for anything for opening weekend that he ever makes for the rest of his life. So I just love the way he creates films. I love the way Michael B. Jordan acts. I love the way that it put a spin on an original but didn't sort of make it hackneyed and old and boring. I'm going to go ahead and say that Creed is a better film than Rocky.
So I had in my notes a lot of things that you just said there. I think that after this movie, I have season tickets for anything that Ryan Coogler puts out. Black Panther, I was going to see no matter what. It's a Marvel movie, but it is marvelous as a Marvel movie, right? Like it stands out against all of those other films cinematically. And so what I think at the heart of Creed's success is that it has heart, and it's told through a strong narrative structure, and it's done stylistically. The way that the camera takes that Dutch angle during the stuntman knockout and you are knocked out with Michael B. Jordan is a great move. And if you do it sparingly, it's really powerful. And I think what we see with Ryan Coogler here is a like deft hand, that there are moments where he could have overdone some things. And that's why I think we're bothered by the graphic overlay introducing the other boxers, because it feels like a gimmick. Everything else that he does feels so intentional and feels sparing. I love the first kiss between Bianca and Adonis. It's an upside down camera angle, right? We're viewing them as they're lying on the floor. And part of the fact that they're lying on the floor feels very rooted in reality. Like that's a thing where it's like, I think everyone at some point in their relationship has had this moment where like you're listening to music with somebody and you're lying on the floor, and it almost seems like nostalgic a little bit. It's upside down. But then we cut to Adonis in the gym, and he's punching the heavy bag, and then he goes down to a crouch. And this is where Rocky, not even talking about what's happening, mentions that line about women weakening the legs. So we're seeing beforehand that Adonis's world has been turned upside down. He's not just focused on boxing anymore, like literally seeing it turned upside down. He's fighting the heavy bag. His legs are weak. And then Rocky drops the wisdom, which is a reference back to Rocky 1. And so there are just those narrative threads that are woven so well together. And that's what I think is the root of what's going on so amazingly here, is that thematically, the stories of fathers and sons and family, the stories of having to fight yourself and face your own inner demons and not doing that alone, the fact that we're all fighting something, like all of those things come again and again and again, but they're not heavy-handed where you feel like it's explicit and they're being shouted at you. And so I think just that level of nuance, the subtlety, but also the repetition is really, really good here. It even happens musically where the Rocky theme shows up, but the Rocky theme is only 4 or 5 notes. So I think in terms of looking at this movie against Rocky 1, it is just much more artful and purposeful and nuanced in a way that feels richer, and it's telling more stories and going deeper into those stories. So I would say Rocky historically will always be the number 2 sports movie because without Rocky, Creed can't exist. That Rocky is a quintessential sports movie, but I think Creed shows us what can be done on a higher level once we kind of study the archaeology of the art form. So since it came first, I think it will kind of cement, because we can't have this without. But I do think that this is the better piece of cinema. Dave, where you at?
I see your points. I will say, I mean, obviously, I can make the argument that, like, it's the original and this doesn't exist without it. But I do think there's elements of that. I mean, it's, you know, who's better, me or my grandpa? You know, I don't exist without my grandpa. But the first original Rocky, in some ways, what makes it so special is that it doesn't have any of these theatrics that we're talking about. And yet it still stands the test of time because of its heart. Where I think Creed does surpass it is that it has the heart, but takes it up by hitting it in a full story where we're seeing everybody has this fight and we spend some time developing all of that. And these characters are developed. And so I think the original Rocky might have had that, that potential, but they didn't get it done. But that groundwork on really a nothing movie, nobody expected the first Rocky to be anything, allowed this to happen. I do think that these movies in some ways are metaphors for the Rocky story themselves. I mean, when I look at Creed and the character Adonis, when he gets knocked down and, you know, Ricky is celebrating, and then somehow Adonis has this like seizure and comes up off the mat. And to me, that's in some ways, that's like the Rocky movie franchise, because as Paul mentioned, so many of those sequels were terrible, but just when you're ready to write it off, you know, Creed rises from the ashes. And I don't think there are moments in the sequels that are good, not Rocky 5. I will agree with Paul, but there are moments in Rocky 2, 3, and 4 that are good. As movies, they're not. I think Rocky 4 is the best of those, but there are moments in those that are good. And Creed puts it together where it's not just a moment. This is a film. This is a film that's good. 2, 3, and 4 I can watch parts of, you know. And then what's great about Creed is it's rewatchable. I want to watch this movie on repeat, because it's got a full story and characters that I do care about. And so to me, that's what kind of sets it apart. But you look at it as a whole, and it is the story of Rocky. It's off the mat. Creed is back, and I'm excited that Creed 3 is coming out, which if they announced another Rocky a decade ago, I would have wanted to go throw up. And so this is I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, I think you're right. The rewatch of Rocky 1 was hard for me. I think if anybody hasn't seen the movie, it's worth watching. But if you've seen it, going back to it is really hard. It just doesn't age well.
I'm telling you, it's grandpa. That's what it is. It's like your grandpa. He's best in your mind, and then you go talk to him, and you're like, "You're getting old, grandpa. This isn't the same."
I talk to students, and they're like, "Yeah, I went and watched that movie you were talking about," because I talk about Rocky all the time, and they're like, "What is wrong with you, man?" And it's like, yeah, it is. It's got a lot of flaws, man. It's bad in a lot of ways. And like in today's climate, the way that Adrian is so quiet and Paulie is such a drunk and Rocky is such a blockhead, and the way that that first moment where, I don't know if you guys remember, when they're dating and then he like suckers her behind the door and closes the door and then like pulls her to the ground and then like kisses her, is like, there's just a lot of things in the first Rocky that's hard to watch, and honestly it just doesn't stand the test of time, you know? So you're right, like the Rocky steps and the statue, that's what we want to remember about Rocky, because that's the things that we all feel inspired by. The movie itself has flaws, so I agree. Creed is eminently rewatchable. I could see it being able to be on repeat for decades. I don't see any flaws that would come up in the same way that the original Rocky had.
The fact that in 2015, Creed was like the 43rd grossing film is really, really surprising. But then when I look at that list of like movies that came out We've got Star Wars, The Force Awakens, Jurassic World, Furious 7, Avengers Age of Ultron. Those are the top 4. Movie making has changed so much. Movie making is about spectacle. It's about characters we already know. And while Creed relies on a character we already know, in a lot of ways we had grown sick of Rocky, that he was stale. And Rocky Balboa kind of ended his story. It revisited his son, and they had a moment of closure. Adrian had passed, and he'd opened the restaurant. And so this is, in a lot of ways, a reboot because we're starting with Creed. It's competing, but it's in a different weight class. And so I think after hearing, Dave, what you were saying, that's a really important thing, is that the sport has changed, and it's really hard to compare Rocky against Creed. Rocky is iconic, and it's iconic for moments. It's iconic for the type of story it told, but it relies heavily on flat characters. It relies heavily on some archetypes. But it was our first introduction to some of those in film. And so a lot of it is, this is the root and Creed is the fruit. And the fruit is always going to maybe look a little bit more appealing. And I don't think it's always like what's fresher or what's the newest. But it's a different style of filmmaking competing in a different film world. So that to me is a really exciting thing, that we can go back to the well and still tell new stories. And I look forward to Creed 3, and I know that there are some beats, but there are emotional aspects that pull you in despite knowing what's going to happen when the final bell rings. And so I think it's maybe an unfair question to try to compare those two things. But I have to say, Creed to me is something I will get sucked in and can watch the whole film of, where Rocky is bits and pieces. Rocky to me is YouTube clips. The emotional aspects of Creed, because it can be slow at times, are rich. When Rocky's not in the ring or training in Rocky, I'm less invested. So it depends on what I'm looking for in the film. Right now, Creed feels the most well-rounded, and I can watch the entire film for the different storylines, where my investment in Rocky going back is to see him training and see him be a boxer. Creed, I want to watch the whole person. And that's an unfair thing. So I guess I gave you a bad question.
I love your line about them being in a different weight class.
Thank you. Well, since that's a high note here, you want to call it? Is this the 12th round?
Ding, 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 ding.
Gentlemen,
You survived. If you made it to the end, you have survived. You should feel good about going the distance.
You went the distance.
I'm Brad Bovenkerk for Paul Krogmeier and Dave Feeney. This has been On Repeat.
Yo, Rocky.